Unbeknownst to me, 7 years ago, I would start reading Steel Ball Run for the very first time without realizing how much it would radically change my life basically forever. However, to make fun of myself, because I was a high schooler, I didn't really understand the major messaging that was going on while reading it for the first time. However, over the past 7 years, I have reread this story countless times, always taking something new from it, whether that be criticizing your own self-character or the yearning of change in some type of way, among a plethora of other things. So I hold Steel Ball Run to a very high regard, and I knew sooner or later the Steel Ball Run anime would come out in some form. However, I was worried for a long while there, as the previous JoJo's part, that being Stone Ocean, was handled very poorly. I can't help but to say that I was a little bit worried for how Steel Ball Run would be presented to the general masses, due to it being my favorite JoJo part and my favorite manga just in general. So how was the Steel Ball Run anime perceived? Well, going off the general perception of the anime itself, yeah, I think it's a banger. However, I would go a few steps further and say it's actually a technical masterpiece that should be reviewed by animators and people in the anime industry, verbatim for forever. Not only will I be reviewing the first stage of the Steel Ball Run anime, but also the 12 chapters within the original manga that also cover it as well, to understand what makes these intros so great for both genre of media. Because fun fact, I've never reviewed any JoJo part, even though I talk about it constantly. Whoopsies. That being said, hello, my name is Metas. Walk with me. So unsurprisingly, I think all of you want me to start off with the anime, so let's just do that. And after a multitude of rewatching of the first stage of Steel Ball Run, I can definitely say that it doesn't lose its charm. It is genuinely one of the best intros to JoJo, point blank period, ever. And where I think that success comes from is the fact that the anime is not a one-for-one with the manga. Comparing the anime's first few minutes versus the introduction of the Steel Ball Run manga, you can start to see the difference almost immediately. Instead of the slow burn that is the manga with Sandman, the anime crew instead tries to replace that with Johnny, instead trying to establish him as the main character / the narrator of our story, quickly flashing through most, if not the original first chapter. It's not until about roughly page 26 where the anime and manga kind of follow each other. However, that is a bit of a lie. The anime crew has decided, for the most part, is to fuse a lot of the manga panels together in order to convey a better story. The Steel Ball Run race is huge, and Araki decides to portray that by showing multiple pages of complaints and the large summer racers gathering on San Diego Beach. However, the anime says we can just do that just through visual storytelling, which they do a phenomenal job at doing. This will be a constant thing throughout this entire first stage. However, personally speaking, I think this is the only media I've ever watched or read that tries to adapt somebody else's story while cutting things out, and in the process of doing that makes it better. I genuinely can't name anything else that does this and succeeds. I think most of that success actually comes from the fact of foresight they've had for a very long time when adapting this part. And looking at director interviews, this seems to be the case. And when it comes to the introduction of Lucy and Steven Steele, main characters that we will see throughout the part, explaining the Steel Ball Run race is much better done in the anime than the manga. However, I think that's because of the medium. Steven and his voice actors really emphasize how grand this race actually is, and how crossing the continent is not an easy thing. While the manga does a very good job at this, I think because of the medium of anime really emphasizes a lot of the minor things you really wouldn't think of while reading this. But I do have a few critiques. While I think a lot of the cuts here so far in the first few minutes of the anime are wonderfully done, I think others could have been left in for the sake of the story. Personally, for me, I would have left in the Crimean War story about the horse and its rider. Kind of really emphasizes the fact that nobody with a really good horse can run hundreds of kilometers per day without getting exhausted or dying from exhaustion. I assume why they cut it is they kind of are figuring the audience kind of knows that traveling the entire continent of America is going to be dangerous, regardless of a horse story or not. So not too big of a critique. However, the other one is different. Lucy not being told to the audience that she's 14. Now, I think I understand why they're not telling us that, because they just want to show off the race without any of the drama. Yet, and saving it for later in the story, which does get explained a few times depending on the extra chapter or the official chapter of those stories being told. However, though, if those stories do not get explained in the future, I think we're gonna have a few problems. However, I can't critique it now because we are not in the future just yet. So far, amazing first few minutes of the anime. Some minor complaints here or there, but so far, wonderful. And then we get to Gyro Zeppeli. The introduction of Gyro Zeppeli with his power, the spin, is done incredibly. I would say in almost every metric, it is a massive improvement to the manga. Originally, there was this weird middle part where we get the backstory of Poco Loco, or the introduction to Poco Loco's character. However, in the anime, they completely remove that and push it towards the end of the episode, allowing the fight just to fully take place right here and right now. And when it comes to the fight itself, it is done really cool. The Hamon sound effects, the spin being introduced in a very unorthodox way for new fans to enjoy, is just a overall treat. It's awesome, it's aura filled, everything you would want in a JoBro is done almost immediately right here, right now with Gyro. Which then allows us to introduce our other main character, Johnny Joestar, who wants to figure out the mysterious power of the spin and how it's able to control muscles, despite the fact that it can do so much more. Anime and manga wise, I love the juxtaposition, Gyro being the strong, intelligent character, but still wanting of something, versus this weak, paraplegic, wanting loser, showing that even though they have their differences, they may be more similar than we think. Then we come into Johnny's backstory, and I can definitely say without a shadow of a doubt that this backstory or interpretation of Johnny's backstory is much better thanks to, and mainly due in part to, the foresight of the anime production. It is nearly virtually the same other than a few scenes being cut that you technically don't need, but then are replaced with foresight for future events later in the part. Looking at Nicholas, I won't spoil it here, but it is great that we get the intro to his brother here rather than later. Also, the added charm they add to the scene where Johnny gets shot beforehand is really cool for his character. This is totally in character for him because, well, before he goes through this giant redemption arc later within Steel Ball Run, it totally makes sense that he would be a cocky asshole beforehand thanks to all the wealth he's accumulated thanks to horse racing. Now with this next scene, there are two things I heavily like and dislike. First, what I like. I love the added additions throughout this point going on forward of the horses' personalities. I like how Valkyrie and Slow Dancer are portrayed within the anime episode because Araki doesn't really give a lot of screen time to the horses just by themselves with their riders and interacting with them personality wise. I like how the anime does that. It's cool seeing Slow Dancer kind of go, hey, I think I'm liking this Johnny guy a little bit more and more, and just seeing Valkyrie interact with Gyro in cute ways is kind of fills the heart with a lot of warmth and love. This might be the fact that I really like horses. I've replayed Red Dead multiple times just for the horses. Aside that, let's get into my major criticism here. During the scene where Gyro is looking at Johnny trying to tame Slow Dancer, there is a specific line he says that if he can ride this horse, quoting him directly, but on the other hand, if he could ride it, that being Slow Dancer, he'd go beyond any human. This line is changed in the anime, both Japanese and English, to just be a stubborn person. I heavily dislike this change because it kind of undermines Johnny's character and what he goes through the entire story. Not to get too crazy here because I just want to stick to the first stage, but the overall story of Steel Ball Run is a very religious one, going through a lot of trials and tribulations, very similar to Dante's Inferno or a religious story you would find in the Bible. By just making him a stubborn person, it kind of undermines the saint-like journey that Johnny has to go through over the course of this journey. Now, I'll save it for later because I'll bitch about this in a different video, but I heavily dislike that change. And the last scene we see before the main race begins is of course of Sandman entering the race. However, it is heavily changed here because it does not show his sister nor his tribe's backstory / motivation for entering the race. And speaking of the race, let's talk about the main bulk of the episode, that being the initial race itself, as the special is named after it, of course. Now I could blow this whole video up for watch time's sake, explaining everything that happens in the race in full detail, everything I like and dislike about it, yada yada yada. However, I respect your guys' time, so I'll give a brief synopsis on how I feel. There is no excuses from any anime studio, point blank period, from this point moving onward, saying that a certain manga is too hard to adapt onto screen. After watching it several times, and even in post editing this, zooming in on the horses, I literally cannot tell the difference between a drawn horse or a CGI horse at all. I literally can't. I don't know how they did it, and however they did it, keep doing it. It is beautiful. Now, to be fair, there are some scenes here or there that look a bit jank that could have had a little bit more work put onto them, but of course, because these are online streaming services, you can change them in post. So no big deal there. Animation and looks aside, the overall feel and engagement of the race is phenomenal, and I have to argue, I think I much prefer the anime's interpretation over the manga's hand over heart, except for a few scenes here or there that explain the horse racers' strategies, in specific looking at Diego's and how he's able to overtake somebody by using specific jockey techniques. Aside that, I was always fully engaged with the initial horse race itself through multiple different viewings. It definitely feels like they put a lot of hard work into animating these scenes for viewers to enjoy, almost like it's an actual race itself, something similar to like NASCAR or an actual, horse derby. I would go as far to say that in a weird way, the horse racing is meant for the anime more than the manga, which for years was always the inverse. Everybody thought the horse race itself being presented in a Rockies format would always be superior. However, I think contradictory here, David Productions is doing a better job of showing the race than Araki ever did. Crucify me for that if you want, but if I were to say the inverse, I feel like I would be lying to you guys. And when it comes to the initial fights during the race, I think all of them are done spectacularly, other than a few panel shots here or there that were replaced for a different visual. Personally speaking, I think my favorite fight has to be Gyro versus Diego, and that's definitely for the sound design, wink wink, nudge nudge. And speaking of sound design, let's talk about the music. Now, over the course of the whole episode, the music has been fantastic. However, in the heavy race portions of the race itself, oh my god, it is fucking-gelic. I need the whole soundtrack now, David Productions, now on my fucking desk. It's great. I absolutely love it. No complaints in the music section at all. Yugo keeps delivering part after part. Aside the general strokes, I think the overall main characters we deal with here during the major portions of the race are all done fantastically, either through their motivations, their character design, their swag or aura factors. All of them are great. Johnny, Sandman, Gyro, Diego, and especially Poco Loco, who I personally think stole the whole show. Now, like I said previously, they kind of moved him around a little bit in terms of how he shows up within the anime here itself. However, the moment he shows up anime-wise, the tone of the whole episode kind of changes. It is very overly serious because of how serious the race is. However, when he shows up, it feels a lot more lively, a lot more fun and dynamic given his personality and what he believes in. Of course, after his initial mess up in the episode, it goes into his backstory explaining how he's incredibly lucky. And from that moment onward, he just continues to show out again and again and again thanks to his incredible luck. I would argue for at least a little bit there, the David Productions team here kind of focuses on Gyro versus Poco Loco as the main fight, in quotation marks there, up until the final battle between all the racers nearing the finish line. However, though, I've yet to explain a pretty major change, arguably the biggest change in the entire first stage, that being not showing Poco Loco stand hey ya. Now, I think I know why they didn't, however, I'll be explaining that later in the video, so keep that in mind. We then come to the ending of the race with a high-speed chase for the finish line with all of our main contenders, with Gyro showing Johnny what the steel balls can actually do given a bit of practice. He turns on the nitro and gaps everybody, ultimately winning the first stage, with the ending bit of the episode ending off with a future Johnny saying that this man is the reason why he can walk again later on in the part. Now, while I didn't talk about everything that happens in this given episode and all the changes that occur, I can say for the most part, even if there were changes that I didn't talk about, they weren't really crazy and didn't really overall affect the story in a major way that I think I needed to make light of. I can say overall that the first stage episode or special was phenomenal in literally every category. I don't think there is really much criticism other than a few dialogue changes and a few script changes in terms of panel shots that really bring this down. I think why this anime adaptation succeeds so much within its first episode, quote unquote, is the David production team here really tried to focus on removing all the extra fluff that wasn't needed while still streamlining what was there that they needed to show. The execution on this is borderline perfect in my opinion. The visuals and the music are just added bonuses basically on top of that. Now, it might be unfair to say that this should be the golden standard when it comes to anime adaptations, and it might, but this is my channel and I want to say what I want to say, so yeah, I think this should be the golden standard when adapting manga onto screen. A very solid 9 out of 10. And speaking of the manga, I think we should go back to Araki's original work here, because while I have been saying there is a lot of fluff that needed to be cut or things that needed to be reorganized, I don't think the manga's presentation of the first stage was that bad in reality. Now, I won't review over every individual chapter like I did with the anime over here, because shockingly enough and thankfully enough, they are virtually almost the same other than a few things that have changed, like I have said previously. So I'll be talking about the broader points here. And I think one of the major successes is the fact that the intro for the manga isn't normal. Most modern manga establish the main character first before anything else. However, Araki during this time writing Steel Ball Run Weekly says, no, I want to establish the race first before anything else. And or the journey, as later on in Steel Ball Run, the race itself starts to lose its main stage factor for something else that we will see later in the second stage. I'm not trying to spoil it, but the conspiracy behind the Steel Ball Run race is a lot more interesting than the race itself, but only becomes interesting because we had it established at the very beginning. So when we look back on it, we have to think about it way differently. Then after that, we are introduced to the spin and our secondary character, Gyro Zeppeli, not our main character, who serve as core fundamental building blocks for this entire part, helping our main character guide their journey, while simultaneously going on their own journey as well. Most manga usually don't do this. They usually wait a little bit to introduce their secondary protagonist and power system. However, Araki sets it up almost near immediately after the premise. And then, and only then, do we get Johnny afterwards. However, his story is split up in between 2 different chapters, so you have to wait for it. All of that is then encapsulated by the fact that this manga is a slow burn. It takes a while before we get to the starting line. Both the anime and manga do this. In the actual episode, it takes about halfway through before we actually see the racers race, and 5 whole chapters before we see that even in the manga. Araki wants you to sit patiently through all of this to really immerse yourself, and I think that's why this intro for Steel Ball Run works so well. It is so uniquely Araki and bizarre, and so anti-shonen. Funny enough, the reason why I say it like that is because eventually Steel Ball Run becomes a monthly manga in Ultra Jump sometime after the intro, and then also becomes a seinen, not a shonen, allowing the story to evolve in a very unique way compared to other JoJo parts, becoming more serious and adult, which further adds to its uniqueness. A bit of a tangent, I know, but the things that are established here in the beginning eventually become so much more interesting later on. If that's not good writing, I don't know what is. It's almost like when you remove the weights and the restrictions, you become stronger. Now, when it comes to the actual race itself, while I think the adaptation does a great job, the original source material has a little bit something special to it. And I think that's how Araki portrays a lot of the stand abilities, the spin abilities, and the actual racers themselves. I did bring this up a little bit in the previous section talking about Diego's skills while racing. I think the interpretation of how he shows it is a lot cooler and a lot more, how do you say, manga or power system wise, rather than it just be a real life technique. Like, yes, Silver Bullet in a real life scenario would of course be wanting to be behind the split stream of another horse. However, how Araki portrays it in the manga seems like it's almost like a stand ability or a spin ability. And I mainly think that's because of the art. Goes to show you how important manga art is to the manga. Who would have figured? So I also think it goes as a cautionary tale to the anime staff to kind of be careful on what they cut and how they portray things, because sometimes a specific character showing off something in a uniquely visual manner is very important. So important that I feel like the adaptation and the manga kind of portray 2 different things while talking about the same thing. During the race itself, Araki really tries to push the idea forward that the spin by itself can challenge a stand given the circumstances, really pushing on forward to us the viewer, independent of Johnny, that the spin is no joke and should be seen as a legitimate way to gain his legs back. Of course, metaphorically and literally. And also being a challenge for stand users. Heiya's luck or Poco Loco's luck glaze has a point. It's trying to show you that despite even being the luckiest man alive, the spin is, well, powerful enough to challenge that. with the race being in the background, but not necessarily out of focus. However, in the anime's adaptation, Heiya is not there. There is a no stand focus look at this race, therefore meaning the secondary plot in the manga, that being the race itself, is now drived up to the forward view. The anime becomes a challenge for Johnny to gain the ability to ride a horse again, and then challenge Gyro by getting to the finish line and then impressing him, leading on to the second stage where, of course, stands show up. So in a way, the anime is holding back a pretty crucial punch and making it much larger for later. All that to say, it's filling a necessary hole of wanting more of the race because the manga eventually slowly loses that. I absolutely adore the new adaptation and the original manga because they become uniquely something different while still talking about the same thing. The anime treats you with a near 42-minute special that respects your time, cuts out all the weird fluff and odd jank here or there thanks to the foresight because, you know, this anime is coming out 15 years after the fact, and makes its adaptation more race heavy while still having a lot of the core themes that the first stage had in the manga. And speaking about the manga is also a fun journey, forcing you to sit down and really engage with the characters and meddle with the themes and ideas that you will be presented later on within the story itself, with it feeling oddly familiar but oddly new at the same time thanks to the scenario it is presenting to you, with new ideas clashing with older ideas separate from the actual characters themselves with you, the viewer. Coming to close, I genuinely think this is how you should do an anime adaptation. Sometimes it is necessary to maybe cut some fluff or rearrange some things, but still be respectful to the original source material while still presenting new ideas within that material, or alternate interpretations that aren't too drastic, still keeping the soul and the flavor of the original material. Absolute cinema, David Productions. You've knocked it out of the park adapting probably Araki's best work, at least when it comes to the start. Other studios genuinely need to take notes. With that all being said, like, comment, share, subscribe. Follow me over on Patreon if you consider supporting me and whatever I do here on this channel. Stay hydrated, and I will see you in the next one, ladies and gentlemen. Deuces.